Kate Milifalcho, welcome back to Irish Granny Helen. It's our Saturday book, and we're on video number 2, The Origin of Satan by Elaine Pagels. I have a feeling this is going to be a controversial book, and I hope not. I hope it doesn't upset people too much. I find it very interesting, so we'll see how it goes. In video number 1, we ended talking about the fact that the followers of Jesus at first sounded a bit like the Essenes. You know, they were challenging authority. The Essenes had withdrawn and were living in caves. They were protesting Jewish life, but they weren't saying it was not good enough. They were saying that it was too collaborative, that they were corrupted by Gentiles, and they wanted them to be stricter. They were exacting in following the traditional laws of Judaism. Jesus was not so pure about the laws. Surprise, surprise. He was pals with a tax collector. That was considered horrifying. He did not fast. I mean, he did fast, but he didn't recommend it. He didn't follow the Sabbath necessarily. He healed a guy on the Sabbath. That was a big thing. He pissed off everybody. He made everybody mad. Fellow Jews, Pharisees, the group that followed Herod. Mark, in his gospel, claimed that they didn't know that Jesus was driven by God's Spirit against evil. Jesus saw that the Jews against him were driven by evil forces. So this is what is going on in Mark's gospel. And that his reaction, Jesus's reaction, was to create the 12 apostles, and to send them out into various places, different communities, to drive out demons. This is according to Mark. The traditional Jews in the community who didn't like Jesus, they accused him of being possessed. And he asks them, well, how can Satan cast out Satan? So he saw the division in the Jewish community as the work of Satan, the house divided is how he looked at it. His personal family thought he was insane. So he says, fine, be that way. I'll make my followers my new family. He starts speaking in parables and riddles. Now, I think it's important to remember that these stories were created. We don't know what's real, what isn't real. They were created by people long after the death of Jesus. They had roots in earlier prophecies and stories of Judaism. But how do I put this? Any part of these stories that accurately portrayed the words or actions of some person called Jesus reflect the fact. Now, this is thinking of religious scholars. This is not, me just giving you an opinion. But the take is that if he said that, it was allegorical. If he did that, the story of him doing that was allegorical. If indeed the story we get is even in any way accurate, but it was written much longer after his death and heavily influenced by previous writings, and that they wanted to be able to say that Jesus fulfilled prophecy, so they connected stories that may not necessarily have been connected during his life. So you see that there's a lot of stuff at play here. There's a lot to digest, a lot of things at play. Jesus accused the Jewish leaders of being hypocrites. So he said, for example, you have all these laws about food, but that's not what's important. It's what comes out of a man that defiles him. Evil comes from within. I'm sorry, it's not important what comes out of a man. Evil is what from within is what is defiling, not the food. He says, forget being kosher, forget worrying about one way or the other, purge your heart. He tells the 12 apostles to blame the scribes and the high priests for what happens to me. That's what he told them, according to the gospel. Who knows? They were afraid of him. The high priests were, after he drove the money lenders out of the temple, because of how the crowd reacted. They were afraid of the mob. So let's see here. What have I got for you? Beware of the scribes who like to go around in long robes and to have salutations in the marketplaces and the best seats in the synagogues and the places of honor at feasts, who devour widows' houses and for a pretense make long prayers. They will receive the greater condemnation. It's Jesus being quoted in Mark. Then he predicts the destruction of the temple according to these gospels. He warns them to flee, tells the apostles, when you see this come down, it's time to get out of here and head for the hills. Mark goes on to describe his betrayal, his arrest, the false charges that were invented by his Jewish enemies, according to Mark. His trial was a pretense, but there are two contradictory versions in Mark about the same event. And the process described and the process that he describes in one of those versions goes against traditional Jewish practices. So, what's he talking about? Essentially, Mark says that Pilate ratified a previous Jewish verdict made by the high priests. They just got Pilate to go along with it. But Pagels, says that Mark had ulterior motives. This was not being written in a vacuum per se. Mark wanted to emphasize the culpability of the Jewish nation for the death of Jesus, particularly of its leaders. Mark's tendency was defensive rather than aggressive. He was concerned to avoid mentioning anything that would provoke Roman antagonism towards or even suspicion of the ideals for which he stood. So think about it a second. If he could make Jewish leaders look guilty for getting rid of Jesus, then the Romans would go, okay, good, they agreed with us. The evangelists therefore contrived to conceal that Jesus had been condemned and executed on a charge of sedition by the Romans. So there's a lot at play here, a lot of psychology and politics and who knows what, creative license. Messiah and the Son of God are anachronistic terms. They would never have used those words and talked about him in those terms during his life, Jesus's life. During his time, they weren't used, but they became popular usage with Christians a generation later. Mark's depictions of Pilate, a guy afraid of the crowd, not convinced about Jesus one way or the other, not sure of his guilt. He wants to avoid sentencing him, and he doesn't want to be the one to order the execution. He washes his hand of the whole thing. The chief priest is in charge. But this is not anything like the known historical facts that have been documented. Pilate was brutal, hostile, negative. Philo says that Pilate was inflexible, stubborn, cruel. His administration was one of greed, violence, robbery, assault, abusive behavior, frequent executions without trial, endless savage ferocity, and all that can go wrong with the Roman administration of the Jewish provinces were seen in Pilate's behavior. Josephus corroborates this. He said Pilate had contempt for the Jewish religious sensibilities. He intentionally picked a garrison with so now I'm remembering. He picked a garrison of soldiers, like a group. They all, they traveled in a pack. He picked one specifically because on their standards, these are the flag things they carried, he knew that they would offend Jewish sensibilities because the Jews believed no false gods, and they had these false golden images on their flags that they carried. That's why he picked them. He also timed bad things that the Roman military did to interfere with Jewish holy days on purpose. The people demonstrated for days to Pilate, please get rid of this garrison. We can't have them around. He got all of the Jewish leaders and people who were complaining to come into a stadium to address them, but he held them there as prisoners, and he threatened to massacre them. But they said, okay, go ahead. They called his bluff, and he had to capitulate. But then he allowed coins to be minted with symbols of pagan cults. He took money from the temple, stole money from the temple to build an aqueduct for himself. There was a large demonstration about this. He put plainclothes soldiers in the crowd to break up demonstrations by killing people. These things ought to feel kind of, I don't know. Eventually, Jewish leaders protested to Tiberius. They sent emissaries to the emperor. So Pilate again held dedication of gold pagan shields in the Herodian palace of Herod, to the divine emperor. And this horrified the Jewish people. This is Jerusalem. We don't want this pagan nonsense. And so there was a big demonstration. They appealed to the emperor again, and the emperor rebuked Pilate. Later, a Samaritan leader assembled the crowd to await a sign from God, part of the Jewish thing. And Pilate had troops attack and killed some and executed the leaders. Pilate was eventually removed. He was ordered back to Rome, and he became more trouble, and he became a liability. Mark paints a far more benign portrait of a Pilate who was afraid and timid and willing to wash his hands of Jesus as the story moves from age to age, farther from the events. As time goes by, Pilate becomes more sympathetic. Conversely, the Jewish community looks worse as these biblical stories proceed through time. Luke and Matthew depicted the followers and customs of Jesus's time to be like their own times. So they took all these events and put them in the context of 2 generations later. And, that's just not accurate. It's not uncommon in various Jewish communities to demonize one's enemies. For example, the Essenes gave evil power many names. They had all kinds of personifications for evil. Over time, more Gentiles joined as followers of Christ, and by the 2nd century, it was more of a Gentile movement than a Jewish movement. And the evil non-believers, people who did not believe in the Messiah, those Jews morphed into enemies, and it became full-blown anti-Semitism, because now those who identified as Christian were mostly Gentile over several generations, and they grew farther and farther away from their original Jewish community. So and their definition of this whole thing was a struggle to define who were the people of God. Mark was Jewish. He wasn't anti-Semitic. He was Jewish. He was just anti, not Christian. Okay, now we're on chapter 2, the social history of Satan from the Hebrew Bible to the Gospels. So, what is in the Hebrew Bible? What are we talking about? Laws, lots of laws, authoritative laws, the stories of the prophets, excuse me, the Psalms, collected ancient writings, and then the Christian parts, the New Testament. This was all compiled to constitute the religious history of the Jewish people as a basis for unifying their society. It was their definitive text. Sectarian writings were left out because they did not identify with Israel as a whole. Christians call these writings of dissidents the Apocrypha, hidden things, and pseudepigrapha, I don't know how to say it exactly, it's Greek. It means false writings. So they picked and chose. And according to the Hebrew Bible, the Lord revealed himself to Abraham and told him, leave everything. And in exchange for doing that and giving 100% loyalty to God, you'll have a new heritage, a new identity, and your enemies will be cursed by God. So here we go. So from the beginning of Israel tradition, there's the people of God, the people of Israel lined up with God against the others. Them were inferior, morally depraved, and even the descendants of Abraham's sons and his allies, even his allies like Sodom and Gomorrah, they were all moralized, as being bad. Moses also was us versus them. This is an early and persistent belief. The Lord makes a distinction between the Egyptians and Israel. This is God speaking through Moses, who threatens the Pharaoh. Scientists say that this is the nature of humans. The world is divided into binary opposites. We talked about that at the beginning of the last video. Sometimes the Hebrew tradition in the Old Testament made exceptions. They say, protect the solitary stranger because you once were strangers in Egypt. Moses embodied this. He was adopted. He was a stranger in a strange land. He was found in the bulrushes by the daughter of the Pharaoh. But in contrast, Israelis in the Old Testament were hostile to other nations and they were backed by God. So we talk about King David, for example. And this book goes a lot into the history that I have kind of glossed over. It's complicated, it's very time consuming, and this is a synopsis. So we'll just gloss over it. David in Psalms, builder of Israel's greatest empire, declares, God gave me vengeance and subdued the nations under us. By this I know that God is pleased with me, in that my enemy has not triumphed over me. God is on our side. Sometimes in its history, a minority of Hebrews blamed misfortune of whatever kind on members of their own people because of their disobedience to God. Remember, we talked about that in Hebrew tradition, they were more likely to say bad luck was punishment from God rather than influence of evil entities. Subtle, but a distinction. The prophets chastised the Israelites who adopted foreign ways. Extreme prophets blamed assimilation. They didn't want them. They wanted them to have a distinct belief system, culture, and way of life. The loss of there's lots of inconsistency in the Old Testament. Boy, ain't that the truth. the Lord is coming to punish the inhabitants of earth. If you read Paul Wallace, which you should, we covered his books, they're in the playlists. These stories are not necessarily about God, Yahweh, as much as they're about entities from other places. It's an interesting theory. Some prophets described enemies of Israel as Canaanite mythological monsters like the Leviathan, the serpent, the dragon. Their enemies took on sort of cosmic forces of utmost malignancy. We didn't just disagree, you are just evil incarnate, was their distinction. They even described some fellow Israelites in these terms, but usually they chose the Satan, one of God's angels, who was treacherous, superior to the other angels, but therefore more dangerous. Old Testament Hebrew Satan is not Christian Satan. The Old Testament Satan is not necessarily evil. He's not necessarily opposed to God. He's an angel. He's one of God's obedient servants. He's a messenger. The word comes from, the word angel comes from the Greek, from the Hebrew, from the Greek. In Hebrew, angels are Elohim, sons of God, like a great army or like a royal court. Satan, with a little s, describes an adversarial role. It's not a name of an entity. It's like a position. The Old Testament spoke of the Satan and any angel sent by God to block humans. And sometimes they were sent by God to obey God by blocking humans because God wanted to interfere with whatever the humans were up to. From the Greek comes the word diablos, the devil, but it really doesn't translate into our notion of the devil. It translates as one who throws something across one's path to block them, to create unexpected obstacles or reversals of fortune. And then they turned around and blamed whatever that blockage was, whatever you got thwarted from doing or having, blame it on sin. Satan is not necessarily malevolent. A Satan, that's a role, not an individual. And not necessarily a malevolent role, a messenger, doing chores for God. God sends a Satan for specific tasks. For example, the angel of death is a Satan. A Satan can be like a roving intelligence agent. Israelites hated the spies of the king of Persia. They called them the king's ears or the king's eyes. And they equated that with evil. As Satan challenges God to test Job, one of God's angels has a little conversation with God and said, let's test this guy. And God defines how and how far the Satan should go. And Job is put through this test and withstands it. And God restores his good fortune that he lost in the test. And all that time, Satan is nobody's enemy and not evil. He's God's obedient servant. However, some blamed the Satan for bringing the census and taxation because they couldn't bring themselves to blame King David when it happened. And then they blamed God for sending a plague that killed 70,000. So Satan's got blamed for factionalism. The factionalism that happened after the king of Persia sent the Jews into Babylonian captivity. Sent the Jews who were in Babylonian captivity out of captivity, sent them back home free, told them to rebuild the temple, to rebuild the city of Jerusalem's walls. And this is in the Old Testament, this is long ago. And they were viewed with suspicion and they were resented. So let's look at this. So now there's two groups inside the Israelites. According to the people who remained, their beloved land was controlled by the enemy, and although the enemy in fact comprised fellow Israelites, yet they regarded these brethren as essentially no different than Canaanites. So God and the Satan chose opposite sides and created divisions within Israel. Later, the Israelites divided again when the Syrian king tried to eradicate Jewish culture and impose Hellenistic culture. Some, the Maccabees, revolted. Others advocated accommodation. Go along to get along. Hellenizing Jews, the ones who wanted to go along, were called traitors to God. The anti-Hellenes won. This would be the Maccabees. But the internal conflict remained. Israel became a theocratic state, but when Pharisees challenged the eventual growing secularism, now there's more division. It was just endless fighting, internecine fighting. During the following decades, other more radical dissident groups joined the Pharisees in denouncing the great high priestly family and its allies. Such groups were anything but uniform. They were fractious, diverse, and with the passage of time included various groups of Essenes, the monastic community at Qumran, as well as their allies in the town and the followers of Jesus of Nazareth. What these groups shared was their opposition to the high priest and his allies and to the temple which they controlled. The majority of Jews, including the Pharisees, still define themselves in traditional terms as Israel against the nations. But these followers of Jesus and the Essenes and all these different sectarian groups of Jewish people believing in schismatic beliefs became the enemy. It became a battle of who was really with God on God's side against who had sided with the foreign nations, good versus evil. They began to equate their opponents as Satans. And eventually, the concept of a Satan morphed into a figure of antagonism to God, an enemy, a rival of God, not the original meaning. And their enemies were seduced by the power of evil in their mind. There were many names for Satan: Beelzebub, Semi-Hazah, Azazel, Belial, the Prince of Darkness, and Satan was just another name for a Satan. They wrote about how these angelic powers were swollen with lust and arrogance and fell from heaven into sin. And they're equating the dominant majority of Jewish contemporaries with these Satans. Satan grew as the personification of insubordination to God, and he got thrown out and was disgraced and sent to the darkness of the pit. Stories were created about how these angelic sons of God lusted after the daughters of men, and they transgressed, producing hybrids, giants on the earth. Later stories said that they were monstrous demons who took over the earth and polluted it. There are apocryphal versions of the Adam and Eve story. Satan is an angel who refused to bow down to Adam, who was younger and a human, and Satan wasn't about God told him, bow before this creation I made. And he said, no, I'm not going to. And as Pagel says, in that story, evil began a sibling rivalry. The moral of all of the stories is that evil came from within their own society. Evil was not an outsider, evil was an intimate enemy. One of us became one of them, just as a Satan was actually derived from an angel. There were popular stories during the times of conflict between and within the Israelites. One apocryphal book was the Book of the Watchers, which was taken out of the Book of Enoch. So there's two stories about watcher angels. Some went after human women, created giants, the Nephilim, the fallen ones, from whom came evil spirits. Then there's the story of angel Azazel, who was sinned. He sinned by teaching humans metallurgy to make weapons and jewelry, which resulted in war and adornment, which was pride. Right? The Greek kings really did claim to be descended from gods and women. The Greek kings claimed to be the descendants of heroes, getting together of full gods and human women. So there's that story runs through quite a few mythologies. The Jewish stories call them greedy monsters. And so the question that begs to be asked, were these really allegorical about the upper crust Jews who married into Gentile families? Because that was really the debate, wasn't it? You're collaborating, you're getting together with Gentiles, and we don't like that. The story of the Watchers can be seen as a paradigm that applies to any number of historical and political situations. The Bible has allegory. Who are God's chosen people? It's not enough anymore. As the Bible morphs, it's not enough anymore to be Jewish. There's that whole thing. Abraham, your people are God's chosen people. But that's not enough anymore. Now the belief is, with these new Christians, is that you have to act morally. Christians really liked this. They ran with this idea, and it divided them from the other Jewish groups. So the author of the Watchers separated ethnic identity from moral identity. No longer were you God's chosen people just by virtue of who you were when you were born. You have to act like it. And this book, apocryphal book, keep in mind, in other words, not included in the official canon, praises universal law, not Mosaic law, universal law. The law that governs the seas, the earth, and the stars. That's a quote. The righteous are addressed, and the righteous include all, good people of good behavior. The author of the Watchers has compassion for any fallen entity, angel or man. He highlights the extreme judgment of the traditional Jews on others. And further into the book, this is what it says. The Watchers, falling like stars from heaven, themselves spawned Israel's foreign enemies, depicted as bloody predators. Lions, leopards, wolves, snakes, intent on destroying Israel, here depicted as a herd of sheep. But as he continues, God's chosen nation is itself divided. Some are blind sheep and others have their eyes open. When the day of judgment comes, he warns, God will destroy the errant ones, these blind sheep, along with Israel's traditional enemies. Furthermore, God will finally gather into his eternal home not only Israel's righteous, but also the righteous from the other nations. And this is all completely ignoring external enemies. The story of the Watchers warns of the perverse generations within Israel. It speaks for the poor, denounces the rich and the powerful. It says slavery arose from oppression and is a sin. Right? Now we see why this is not included. This is not popular with the authoritarian powers that eventually headed the Christian church. Eventually, this book makes clear the distinction that anyone who is righteous is against anyone seduced by the Satans. This redefines humans in terms of moral qualities and not in terms of ethnicity or political identification. Another book that was left out from the New Testament is Jubilees. And this laments that certain people in the Jewish community were taking the ways of Gentiles, and it blames internal Satans and internal division. But it concludes that every creature shall be judged according to deeds. Fallen angels who brought evil ways, they don't have immunity. Your destiny depends on your moral action and repentance. Now, this stuff we're talking about here, these are not my words, and I'm not espousing this as true or not true. We're looking at the history of books left out of the Bible. And one is called Jubilees, and it says that each nation is ruled by an angel to lead it astray, but God rules Israel to bless the people. But being children of Israel does not guarantee deliverance from evil, but there will be divine help in the moral struggle. It depicts the people as corruptible. The schism of the early Christians from the majority of the Israelites occurred as some identified with ethnicity and others with moral imperative above ethnicity. Many apocryphal Old Testament writings warn against the contamination of Gentiles. They are warned not to break the people's covenant with God. The book of Daniel avoids a discussion of sectarian enemies, and it focuses on external enemies, the Russians, them too, the Persians, the Medians, etc. Foreign rulers are equated with mythological beasts, but Israelites are aligned with God and assured of survival. This identification with that ethnicity above all else is probably why this book is canonical and not apocryphal, the book of Daniel. So, this is how these books were chosen. How did they toe the line? What picture did they paint? How traditional were they? The Essenes emphasized the cosmic good and evil battle over ethnicity, and they were not in favor. Josephus said, the Essenes practiced great holiness. They loved one another. They lived without money. They saw the majority going into accommodation with the enemy, foreign occupation. And the Essenes saw this as evidence of the forces of evil taking over. They blamed Satan's. They said God's own people were allied with the evil ones. Pagels says the Essenes were only about 4,000 men at the core living in this community. They didn't have women and children. But then she also says this is not conclusive. We don't know for sure. They have not fully explored the archaeology in the area. They found some bodies of women and children, but they think they lived outside the community in family groups. They just don't know. They do know that they had adjunct members who were couples, families, And the most dedicated, the ones that were really dedicated, lived in withdrawal from the world as a protest in these desert caves. It was a rigorous community rule. They only wore white. They had strict laws for daily life. They believed the Prince of Light was given by God as a supernatural ally to them, and that Satan ruled the darkness. This is the Essenes we're talking about again. They called themselves the sons of light. They called the rest of the Israelites the congregation of traitors, and they considered Israel's history a cosmic battle. They awaited God and the armies of heaven to come and annihilate the corrupt majority and foreign enemies too, while they're at it. The Essenes were very clear. There was a cosmic war. God and his allies, good. The Satans and their allies, evil. The Essenes' biggest battle was with their fellow Israelites who had gone over to the Satans. They called that Satan of that group Belior, which means without light, sons of darkness. They agreed with the book of Jubilees that being Jewish was not enough. The sins of the people have canceled God's covenant with Abraham. It's how you live that matters. You must go into a new covenant, and the Essenes, they considered themselves starting this new covenant. You had to be on probation to join for several years. You had to confess your sins. You had to turn over all your property. You had to take an oath to sexual abstinence. They had ritual purity in what food they ate, how they spoke, what they touched. For example, I thought this was really weird. They didn't touch cooking pots and plates or utensils. They forbade swearing. You could not complain. I would not make a good Essene. You could not complain. No spitting. And no talking out of turn. So, I mean, that seals it in a way. Once you finish probation and gained admission, you must ritually curse all non-initiates. And you are then told the secret names of angels, but you have to keep them secret. And you're striving as a fully fledged Essene to unite with the angels. These are actually as close as we can see to what the followers of Jesus did in Mark's description. The Essenes, though, they were more restrictive. They only allowed firstborn male Jewish members. There were adjunct members, kind of like Opus Dei. Jesus, his followers were more inclusive of the outside world, and as we know, eventually after 200 years, they were mostly Gentile, ethnically speaking. The Essenes were against assimilation, but for universalism, which is kind of an interesting contradiction. So they want you to set your ethnic identity aside, but they wanted to emphasize moral action. And universalism is about the, like natural law, that the same rules apply to nature, the sea, the sky, the stars, the earth, the animals, and people. The Prince of Light, which later became equated with the angel Michael, the archangel Michael. The Prince of Light was not who they were talking about. The Prince of Light was the universal energy that was against the Prince of Darkness, which was the Satan's evil. And it's within all people, not just within Jewish people. But these guys who are saying this were exclusively male firstborn Jews. So there's a little cognitive dissonance going on. The followers of Jesus, they were okay with Gentiles being in their group. Now, the Essenes and Mark in his Gospels both look at this as a big cosmic war of good versus evil within the Jewish community. And 20 years after Mark, so we're talking 2 generations after roughly Jesus, Matthew in his Gospels, he sees it the same way, good versus evil. By the time of Matthew, Jesus's followers were a marginal group, very much opposed by the Pharisees, who had risen as the in charge guys of the Jewish community. Very much the intimate enemy, in other words. Now, Luke is interesting. Luke was a convert. He was a Gentile. And he considered his sect to be Israel at its very best. He said the followers of Jesus are the only true Israelites left. And about the year 90 to the year 100 CE, John, his viewpoint was the view of a radical sectarian group alienated from the Jewish community because they strongly believed Jesus was the Messiah, and anyone who didn't agree was wrong, period. They were as bitter in their attitude against other Jews in the community as the Essenes were. I think I'm going to end here because we're at the end of the chapter, and I just hate trying to repeat things because I've forgotten what we just talked about. So we'll start video number 3 at the beginning of chapter 3. So I hope this is not too confusing. It's kind of a difficult book to synopsize because there's so much detail in it. But I hope you're finding it interesting. Let me know. Let me know if I need to re-explain something or maybe understand it the first time myself. We'll see. But in the meantime, hope you're enjoying this, and thanks very much for sitting through it with me. Slánga foil. Slánja.